Imperium. The Philosophy of History and Politics. Francis Parker Yockey, under the pen name Ulick Varange. The World Situation. Imagination rules the world. Napoleon. For the tasks of the next century, the methods of popular representation are the most inappropriate imaginable. The condition of Europe in the next century will once again lead to the breeding of manly virtues, because men will live in continual danger. I see over and beyond all these national wars, new empires, and whatever else lies in the foreground. What I am concerned with, for I see it preparing itself slowly and hesitatingly, is the united Europe. The nations which got to be worth anything never attained to that condition under liberal institutions. Great danger made out of them something which deserves reverence, that danger which alone can make us aware of our resources, our virtues, our means of defense, our weapons, our genius which compels us to be strong. Nietzsche. Pacifism will remain an ideal, war a fact, and if the white race decides to wage it no longer, the colored will, and will become the rulers of the world. Spengler. The political world. Politics is related to war, and war uses strategy. Strategy immediately involves the fundamental realities of physical and human geography. And so an examination of the facts and possibilities of world politics begins with geography. In this age of absolute politics, the entire earth ball is the object of the power instincts of both the Western civilization, and, by a process of outer negation that is just as total as the Western imperialistic affirmation, also the extra-Western forces. Therefore the general geographic picture of the planet is the point of departure. Dividing the world into two longitudinal hemispheres along the 20th meridian, it is seen that in the eastern hemisphere is the landmass Asia-Africa, the outlying islands Australia and Oceania, and most of Antarctica. The total landmass is more than 100 million quadrat kilometers. In the western hemisphere are the two connected islands North and South America, and part of Antarctica. These areas are 47 million quadrat kilometers, less than half the landmass in the eastern hemisphere. More important than area is population, for power means control over people, and they can only be controlled politically where they are. The population of the eastern hemisphere is approximately 1,700,000,000 persons, while that of the western is only 300 million. This means that the world, politically speaking, is in the eastern hemisphere. The planet can also be divided into a northern and southern hemisphere, along the equator. In this division, more than 9/10 of both land area and population lie in the northern hemisphere. If the planet be divided into quadrants, it is seen that more than half of the population of the great landmass Asia-Africa, or approximately half the total population of the planet, is in the northeast quadrant. This includes Europe, most of Russia, India, Asia Minor, and most of Africa. This entire landmass is contiguous except for indentation by the narrow seas, the Mediterranean, the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Baltic. The whole area is controllable by land power, including the narrow seas, whose entrances are commanded by the land. It is thus quite obvious that world control means in the first instance control of this northeast Earth quadrant. In the second instance, world control means domination of the landmass Asia-Africa. Thirdly, it means control of the northern hemisphere, and lastly, control of all the waters and land of the planet. The northeast quadrant, being the most important area, is the focus of all 20th century imperialism. These fundamental geographical facts are the basis of all large-scale political thinking. The basis, but not the source, for the origin of grand thinking of any kind whatever is a high culture, making itself effective through a culture-bearing stratum of human beings. The science of geopolitics was itself a knowledge system created by a high culture which had arrived at the stage of unlimited imperialism, the age of absolute politics. It bore however within it a remnant of materialistic thinking which led to the error of placing the origin, determination, or motivation, of politics in physical facts. This was an absolute error, since all materialism, as a description of facts, is an absolute error. The origin of ideas, impulses, experience, is the soul. The origin of politics itself is the human soul. The origin of grand creative politics is the soul of a high culture. The origin of destructive politics is in the negation, by the souls of outer populations, of the political imperative of a high culture. In the present stage of the Western civilization, the motivation of politics is in culture, and no longer in nationalism or economics, as was often the case in the 19th century. The spiritual unity of the Western civilization and its colonies is a fact, and this prime fact is the source of the great political contest in this century. The unlimited imperialism of the West has created in the outer populations an equally strong will to destroy Western imperialism. The only way it can do this is by its own imperialism. Thus the idea of Imperium dominates the form of the world struggle of this century and the next. Whether one is in its service or opposing it, he is coerced by its universality. The error of geopolitics was in thinking that the outer could determine the inner. But the soul is always primary, and the use made of material, or of geographic position, is a mere reflex of the type of soul. The American Indians had far more resources than the American colonials, yet their primitivity and techniques left them helpless. Total technical superiority, however, is not material superiority, but spiritual superiority. Geopolitics, as developed before this time, was not founded on the 20th century view of history and politics, but on tacit materialistic ideas left over from the 19th century. The researches of this science have, however, permanent value, and its assertion of large space thinking was an historically essential development. The name of Haushofer will remain honored in Western thought. The future of geopolitics will be readaptation of the whole structure to the fundamental spiritual orientation of the world, the division between the rest and its colonies on the one hand, and the outer forces on the other. The First World War. After the successful conclusion by England of the Boer War in 1901, and the Western crushing of the Boxer Rebellion in China, the entire world, with the exception of a few small areas, was under the direct rule of the West and its colonies. In the Far East, only Japan and Siam were excluded; in the Near East, only Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan; in Africa, only Abyssinia and Liberia; in the other hemisphere, only Haiti and Mexico. Of these, Western control was indirect in Turkey, Mexico, and Afghanistan. In Islam and in China, Westerners were under the exterritorial jurisdiction of their national representatives, and not under local tribunals. The conduct of the outer peoples to the Westerners was respectful and deferential. In one word, the entire outer world was politically passive. This passivity alone made possible the grotesque disproportion between numbers and control. In India, for instance, England maintained its rule over 350 million subjects with a garrison of less than 100,000 white soldiers. In the Indian Mutiny of 1857, England found its control of India restricted in a few days to parts of the coast and a few points in the interior. So swiftly can white rule of non-Western territory vanish when the subject populations become active politically. With the political passivity of the outer subjects went another important fact in the worldwide power monopoly of the West before 1914. This was the comedy of the Western peoples. Paul Kruger was a symbol of this comedy. In the Boer War, fighting against crushing odds though he was, he nevertheless resolutely forbade the employment of Negro barbarians against white Englishmen. The political genius his conduct showed was not appreciated. Two great historical developments were on foot in the world in the period of preparation of the First World War: the emerging within the Western soul of the superpersonal idea of ethical socialism as the form of the next Western age, and the growth, in the outer forces, of a worldwide revolt against Western domination. These two developments on the planet were the actual problems of the First World War. They were the world historical tendencies which would form the inner content of the coming World War, the inexorable approach of which was seen by all the leading brains of Europe. This great development was seen and described by many men of action and thinkers, among them Rudolf Schellen, Werner Zombart, Paul Rohrbach, Bernhardi, Lord Kitchener, Homer Lee. The age of capitalism was drawing to its close. England, the power which had been created by this idea, and which had been in its service, had actualized completely this phase of the organic development of the Western soul. Prussia Germany was the power embodying the next phase, the actualization of ethical socialism. Thus the inner development of the West tended to take the form of a contest between these two powers. Prussia Germany was in the nation style of the age of capitalism. It too was parliamentary democratic, and was engaging in commercial imperialism. It was differentiated from England by the presence within it of the new superpersonal idea of ethical socialism. England had conquered, with its historically magnificent inner imperative, the largest empire in history up to that time. The Western world monopoly of power was based primarily on the British Empire. To the outer forces which were waking into anti-Western political activity in Africa, China, Japan, the East Indies, Russia, there was no difference between the Western nations. The great fact of Western nationalism was already by that time a great illusion, from which, however, only the Western peoples were suffering. The outer world knew better than the West that the West was historically a unit, not a collection of spiritually sovereign nations. The superficial form of the First World War was a nationalistic contest between two 19th-century-style Western nations. Superficially, it was England v. Prussia Germany; actually it was capitalism v. socialism. Superficially it was a war between two nationalistic coalitions; actually it was a war of the outer forces against the entire Western civilization. By 1916, it was quite clear that the military contest between Germany and England was a draw, and that continuance of the war between them would only result in a defeat for both. The longer the war continued, the more clear this became. Japan's famous 21 demands were a test of Western strength in the Far East, and the West yielded in the middle of its suicidal war. Japan was obviously winning the war by remaining out of it, America was obviously winning, the revolution in Russia showed that the entire West was losing. The power that had resided in Europe was steadily transferred, as the First World War continued, to the outer forces, Japan, Russia, America. From the old-fashioned, nationalistic standpoint, England was losing, and from the new viewpoint, the whole West was losing. If senile, uncreative brains had not dominated events, a European peace would have been concluded in 1916 to salvage Europe's world power position. But weak heads, finance capitalistic thinking, and mental rigidity, prevailed. Not only was the suicidal war continued to its bitter end, but the outer forces were mobilized to take part in the actual fighting. England and France scraped their colonial empires for colored forces to use against the entire Western civilization including themselves, for the outer forces had always regarded the West as a unity. The genius of Paul Kruger had not been understood. If the only way to defeat an opponent is through suicide, the war has lost its meaning, and should be terminated. But the realizing of simple propositions like these takes genius, and that was nowhere present at the helm of European affairs. For more than a century England had been arbiter of Europe, it had been able to prevent any power taking first place. During this period, it had controlled all the seas of the world, it had been able to deny them to any power it wished, and over them it had maintained uninterrupted communications with its overseas empire. Therewith, it had also been commercially supreme in the world, and could gain any foreign market it wished or needed. In 1918, with the victory of England in the First World War, it found that it now had to share the seas with America and Japan. Its commercial supremacy was gone, and its military political power was steadily declining in relation to the outer forces. Germany had lost in a military sense, but still had lost far less than England, for it had less to lose. The true, political, victors were Japan, Russia and in a purely external sense America. The great loser was the Western civilization. This brings us to the large-scale political results of the war. The world problems of 1914 were two, the inner one of the rising ethical socialism, and the outer one of the growing world revolt against the West. How were they resolved? The inner problem was resolved in the only way such an organic development can be resolved: socialism triumphed over capitalism, and the further behind the World War was left, the more obvious this became. The parliamentary capitalistic materialistic method of thought and action could not cope with the new world situation and its organization problems. Sickness spread over the life of the West: spiritual, political, social, economic. This sickness could only be cured by the new attitude of ethical socialism toward all these problems. The great, outer problem of the war was resolved against the West. All over the world, the subject population stirred threateningly. Foundations of the empires of the old-style Western nations were shaking, cracking. Where yesterday the Westerner had commanded, he now had to cajole and to promise. Where formerly he could move freely and proudly, he had now to be circumspect and fearful, as official, revolt, and as individual, of sudden death. The saddling of barbarian occupation troops on a Western nation after the First World War confirmed and strengthened the outer revolt against the West. The barbarians were given the feeling they could lord it over the white man. Anti-Western activity flamed all over the world, in South America, Mexico, the East Indies, Islam, Japan, China, Russia. What did this mean? The indispensable basis of the Western domination of the entire outer world had been the political passivity of the subject peoples. After the First World War, all over the Asiatic African landmass, the subjects became active, they began to stir a revolt, oppose, boycott, sabotage, demand, hope, and hate. The war had undermined the very basis of the Western world system. The third result of the First World War was on the same scale: an old spiritual world was swept away, the entire spiritual foundation of the 19th century vanished. Economic individualism, parliamentarism, capitalism, materialism, democracy, money thinking, trade imperialism, nationalism and petty statism. The end of capitalism and nationalism was symbolized by the creation and the genius of Benito Mussolini, who proclaimed in the teeth of the apparent world victory of 19th century ideas, the organization will and inner imperative of the 20th century, the resurgence of authority, and ethical socialism. Precisely when the materialistic ideologists were playing logical exercises with international politics, and creating a stupid and useless League of Nations, this herald of the future defied the stillborn nonsense of Geneva, and re-embodied the will to power and heroism of Western man. Over the paeans of democracy, Mussolini spoke of the corpse of democracy. The word nationalism changed its meaning after the First World War. From having meant frontier squabbling and jingo patriotism, It meant henceforth the idea of Western unity. The nationalists in every country sought the welfare of their own countries in Western unity, through the doing away with intra-Western wars, which would automatically create a new political organism. The old petty statism of the West was in fact destroyed by the First World War, although this was not historically visible at the time. Not one of the former Western nations had sufficient political strength to engage the outer political forces. In other words, each one had ceased to be a political unit fit for the great world struggle. But they had not yet realized their own unity, and hence the outer world was able to continue along the same lines of growing anti-Western activity which the war had begun. The Second World War. The First World War was a failure as far as solving the two great problems which formed the true, historical issues of that war. It resolved the issue of capitalism v. socialism by giving the apparent and material victory to capitalism, which represented the past, and could not possibly form the future. In other words, the result of the war was a mere political negation of the coming spirit of ethical socialism. It resolved the issue of the world revolt in favor of the outer forces, and against the Western civilization. This result was historically completely false, for such an outcome did not reflect the great spiritual realities. In reality, the spirit of the West was then only entering upon its grandest imperialistic stage, possessed of the necessary material power to actualize its inner imperative of unlimited, authoritarian, political imperialism. The historically false eventuation of the war had not corresponded to these great spiritual realities, but had made it appear superficially as though the West was tired, and in retreat from its world position, and that the outer world had sufficient vigor to dethrone the Western master of yesterday. In its third great result, the complete sweeping away of the spiritual foundations of the 19th century, the war was also a failure to the extent that it only accomplished this great transformation in the depths, but on the surface of history the ideals and slogans of the dead past were still the object of the lip service of the uniformly stupid leaders whom the war had tossed up. These ideals were even carried to limits of comedy which would have been out of the question for the 19th century. For, apart from its tragic significance as a symbol of the victory of the barbarian over the West, the League of Nations was simply a huge world historical joke. But destiny is irreversible, and the spirit of socialism, with its latent resurgence of authority and its youthful will to power, moved steadily forward. The spirit of the age caught up the former powers of Europe, one after another. Only the intervention of two extra-European regimes, those in Moscow and Washington, prevented the complete inner pacification of Europe. This inner pacification would have meant, as the analysis of politics showed, the automatic creation of a new world political unit, Europe, the civilization of the West organized as a politico-economic, spiritual, cultural, national, military unit. The powers that had existed in the 19th century had become in the last analysis mere spectators in the world struggle. Russia, America, and Japan were the new arbiters of the world situation during the 20s and 30s of the 20th century. This was the legacy of the First World War and of the blindness that had continued it to the point where England's allies had triumphed over England as well as over Prussia, Germany. The rise to absolute dictator of the culture-distorting group in America enabled American power to frustrate the pacification of Europe as the prelude to European reconquest of its lost world position of 1900, the status of power monopolist of the world. By parliamentary financial propaganda means, culture distortion brought part of Europe under the control of Washington, and determined the form of the Second World War. The European Revolution of 1933 let loose the most tremendous spiritual force that history knows, destiny, the advancing spirit of the age. It was this same force that had given to the armies of France their victories on hundreds of fields all over Europe during the wars from 1790 to 1815. Against this destiny, no inner forces of the culture could prevail. To defeat Napoleon, it was necessary to call in Russia, and even then victory was only on the surface, for Napoleon had been the symbol of destruction of the foundations of the 18th century. These foundations could not be rebuilt, even though the gentlemen of the Vienna Congress thought it could be done. In form, the Second World War started along the same lines as had the First. Superficially, it appeared to be a petty state contest between two European powers of yesterday. In its depths, the war was no such thing. Even the struggle between socialism and capitalism, which was an apparent issue of the war, was not real, for the issue had been settled in favor of socialism. The alternative to socialism was not capitalism, but chaos. This brings us to the real problems of the Second World War. During the years 1918 to 1939, the 20th century idea had triumphed all over the West, and only the intervention of the outer forces based in Moscow and Washington had frustrated the foundation of general European unity. In the outer world, the revolt against the West had increased to frightful dimension. In India, China, Japan, Islam, Africa, Mexico, Central and South America, the Caribbean, the East Indies, and above all in Bolshevist Russia. This outer development had been accelerated by the First World War, instead of being denied and put down as the true distribution of military force would have brought about. As a consequence, this gigantic outer revolt dominated the world picture. The reversing of this outer revolt, and the reassertion of the imperialistic vigor of the West, was the great problem of the world situation in 1939. In its shade stood the problem of completing the unity of the West by driving out extra-European influence from the home soil of the West. Nevertheless, owing to the American Revolution of 1933, and the conquest of American power by culture distortion, the war started in a disastrous form, that of a struggle between two former European powers. The culture-distorting group had not only its old mission of revenge against the West for a millennium of insult and persecution, but it was flaming with the unparalleled injury that was done to it by the renewal of Western exclusiveness in the European Revolution of 1933. For the first time, anti-Semitism was as total as Semitism. Mere social anti-Semitism was welcome to the culture distorter, for it unified his followers. But cultural anti-Semitism meant the end of the sway of power within the West of the distorter. Against this threat, the culture distorter armed for a war which he was willing to continue if necessary to the physical extinction of the Western world. He developed a senseless formula, entirely new in European history: unconditional surrender. This formula transcends politics. Politics aims at political surrender, not personal humiliation, deprivation of life, of honor, of rank, of humanity and decency. In the form in which it started, its grand problem was doomed. The revolt of the outer forces against the West was temporarily overshadowed by the suicidal struggle between white Western troops against white Western troops, all of whom were slaughtered for the defeat of the West and the triumph of outer forces. Who won the Second World War? First of all, in the military sense, America and Russia, for at the conclusion of the war, the world presented the picture of being divided between them. Russia dominated half of the political world, most of the northeast quadrant of the planet, and America dominated the other half. But, as we have seen, America threw away the greater part of its military victory, since the force governing American policy was not American, and hence could not pursue a Western policy of empire building, but could only exercise a distorting influence on American policy. Second, in the political sense, Russia, and, probably, Japan. America cannot be said to be a political winner, since it has steadily lost power since the end of the war. A country in the custody of total, cultural, aliens cannot gain a political victory, since whatever military victories it may achieve will be used only for the benefit of the alien, and not for the benefit of the subject nation. This lies in the nature of the host-parasite relationship, and America is an instance of it. Russia, however, gained enormously in strength in every way through its victory, which was won for it by American forces. Russia's power is ascendant everywhere as the result of the war, and it is the only power which can definitely be said to have won the war. After 2 decades, however, it is probable that Japan also will be seen to have won the war, although naturally such a view is put forward with reservation as to intervening events. But the benevolent and protective occupation by American forces to rebuild the Japanese economy and political power might reach a certain point at which the occupier will find that a new power relationship exists. Third, in the spiritual sense, the great collective victor is the world revolt against the West. Leading them is the architect of the war, the culture distorter. From the top of a mountain of Western dead, he can regard his mission of revenge as having been apparently completely accomplished. Behind him is the spirit of Asiatic Bolshevism, which now lords it over the rotten West, as 19th-century Russian literators named the Europe they hated so much. Then, everywhere, stand the outer forces, renewed in hope and success by the retreat of the West they have forced and continued to force daily. In India, Egypt, China, the East Indies, they stride forward, and the white man retreats steadily. Those are the victors. Who are the vanquished? First of all, Europe, the home soil of the West. The organism of Western civilization lost the war just as definitely as Russia won. The millions who died in battle, the hundreds of thousands slaughtered in their homes by American warfare against civilians, the millions who have been starved and frozen to death by the American-Russian occupation, the millions who are still starving and freezing, all these died, and are dying for the victory of Asiatic Russia, culture distortion, and the world revolt against the West. The awful reality of the defeat of the West raises another aspect of the Second World War, the economic. As already seen, the political basis of the Western power monopoly in the world before the First World War, 1914, was the political passivity of the subject peoples. Its economic basis was the technical industrial monopoly of the Western civilization. The hundreds of millions who live in the tiny area of Europe are there because this economic monopoly permitted them to live from food imports. The food imports, and the fabulously high Western living standard, were maintained by Western production of manufactured goods for the outer markers. The many hundreds of millions of Asia and Africa had to meet all their requirements for manufactured goods in the Western civilization. The first two world wars undermined this situation completely. Giant industrial areas have been built up all over the outer world. The revolt against the West is economic as well as political. What does this mean? It means this, that not only the power of the West is undermined, but the livelihood of the West has also been cut off. The great problem of the Second World War, the restoration of Western world power, had thus also an economic aspect. It was a struggle for the biological existence of more than 100 million Westerners. The world situation of the moment thus wears the aspect not only of a struggle for power, what is usual and universal in nature, but of that which is extremely rare, but hideous and unheroic, a struggle for physiological existence. Not only Europe, but also the American people lost the war. Since the Revolution of 1933, this people has been working, producing, and exporting. It has given its treasures and the lives of hundreds of thousands of its sons. It has blindly obeyed culturally alien leaders not of its choosing, and in obedience to them it has curtailed its standard of life and parted with its soul, and in return it has received nothing of any kind, spiritual or material. Nor is its time of sacrifices over. It will continue to pay for the Second World War, which it lost, for many a year. In America's cup of victory, there was poison for the soul of America. Russia. The participation of Russia as a political unit in Western history begins with Peter the Great. Before that, Russia had only engaged in political competition with Slavic states bordering on the Western culture area. During the centuries before Peter, there had always been two ways of thinking in Russia. The one was the feeling in the broad masses of peasants and men of strong instincts, the other was the more intellectual desire to adopt Western forms of thought and action and force them on the Slavic population. This latter was confined to a small stratum, the physical descendants of the Varangians, who had invaded Russia from Scandinavia during Charlemagne's time, and was recruited from time to time with new blood from Sweden and Germany. With this stratum, Peter overcame the old Russian faction, and dragged an unwilling Russia into the comity of Western nations. Never did he succeed, nor did his Romanov dynasty after him, in implanting Western ideas below the surface of the Russian soul. Russia, the true, spiritual Russia, is primitive in religions. It detests Western culture, civilization, nations, arts, state forms, ideas, religion, cities, technology. This hatred is natural and organic, for this population lies outside the Western organism, and everything Western is therefore hostile and deadly to the Russian soul. The true Russia is the one which Petronism tried to coerce. It is the Russia of Ilya Muromets, Minin, Ivan Grozny, Pashersky, Theophilus of Pskov, of Okhim, Boris Godunov, Arakcheyev, Dostoevsky, the Skopsky and Vasily Shuisky. It is the Russia of Moscow, the Third Rome, the mystical successor to Rome and Byzantium. A fourth there cannot be, wrote the monk Theophilus. This Russia identifies itself with humanity, and despises the rotten West. Being primitive, Russia's spiritual center of gravity is in instinct, and thus it was that even during the rationalistic equalitarian 19th century, Russia was a land of pogroms. The Russian felt the complete alienness of the culture, state, nation, church, race of the Jew, and the Tsarist regime marked out a pale of settlement in which alone Jews could reside. The Upper Russia, the westernized stratum which played with Western materialistic philosophy, spoke German and French, traveled to the spas of Europe, and concerned itself with European cabinet politics, was the object of the fierce hatred of the pure Russians, the nihilists, who embodied the wordless idea of complete destruction of the West, and the Russification of the world. Whether this great destructive idea was expressed in the religious form of the assertion of the sole truth of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, or of the later political form of Slavophilism and Panslavism, or of the present-day Marxist Bolshevism, it continues to have the same inner imperative of destroying everything Western, which it feels is stifling its Russian soul. The Bolshevik Revolution of November, 1917, was a political epoch both for Russia and for Europe. The possibility of such a revolution had, of course, always been there, as shown by Pugachev's insurrection during Catherine the Great's reign, by the numerous assassinations in the 19th and 20th centuries, by the huge underworld shown in the writings of Dostoevsky, by the huge secret police and spy network. The actual form of the revolution when it did occur was dual. There was a revolt of the primitive Russian soul against the Western Romanov regime and all that it represented, and there was a simultaneous assumption of the leadership of this revolt by the Jewish culture nation-state race. The necessary financing was procured in New York from members of the culture distorting group in America. The influence of culture distortion on Russian policy has not been of the same degree as its influence in America, at least in foreign policy, for the world aim of Russia is the same as the aim of the culture-distorting group: destruction of the Western enemy. Nevertheless, it is present, and is responsible in a great measure for Russian policy. With means both skillful and brutal, it maintained its power in Russia. The duality of the Bolshevik Revolution meant that the one side of it was a failure, the primitive, Asiatic, instinctive side. The aim of the Russian side of the rising was to sweep away all Western institutions, ideas, forms, and realities. Thus it wished to extirpate the Western technology and economic forms as well as the other aspects of the Westernization of Russia. In this it did not succeed, for the Bolshevist minority set itself to Western industrialize Russia to the highest possible degree in preparation for a series of wars against hated Europe. During the period 1918 to 1939, Russian policy abroad was actualized through its international organization, the Comintern, comprising all the communist parties in the Western civilization. The policy of the distorting group and the true Russia coincide in undermining the West from within by making use of the remnants of the outworn 19th century outlook in their most degenerate forms: class war, trade unionism, financial manipulations, pacifism, parliamentarism, democracy, corruption of art and letters, social traditional decay. Such inner undermining was to be, of course, simply the prelude to complete domination. If necessary, the last, military stage was to be applied at the time when the inner rottenness had made resistance hopeless. But the European Revolution of 1933 completely destroyed the value of this technique. By its positive and vigorous reassertion of the primal instincts of the West, and of the world mission of the West, it made any undermining attempts hopeless, for the exclusiveness of the 20th century West is organically inaccessible to anything culturally alien. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 was brought about by culture distortion within the West, in cooperation with the Bolshevik regime in Moscow. The Bolshevik assessment of the possibilities was that the intra-European war would bleed the West to the point where Russian armies could occupy the entire West with a comparatively small military effort, and establish the world rule of the Third Rome on a foundation of the ruin of the West. Things did not work this way at once, and the Bolshevik regime almost found itself in New York at one point in the Second World War. But the total intervention of America was finally brought about by the culture-distorting group in America, and as a result, Russia was not only saved, but given a military victory which made it master of the largest contiguous empire ever to exist in the history of the world, and an empire situated moreover in a commanding position in the center of the political world, the northeast quadrant of the planet. 2. Thus, there are two Russias, the Bolshevik regime, and the true Russia underneath. Bolshevism, with its worship of Western technology, and of a silly foreign theory of class war, does not express the soul of the true Russia. This broke out in the insurrection of the Streltsy against Peter the Great, and of Pugachev against Catherine the Great. In his rebellion, Pugachev and his peasants massacred every officer, official, and nobleman that fell into their hands. Everything having any connection with the West was burned or destroyed. Whole tribes joined in the mass movement. For 3 years, 1772 to 1775, it continued, and the Moscow court itself was at one time in danger. When arraigned after his capture, Pugachev explained that it was God's will that he should chastise Russia. This spirit is still there, since it is organic, and cannot be killed, but must express itself. This is the spirit of Asiatic Bolshevism, which is at present harnessed to the Bolshevism of the Moscow regime, with its economic technical obsession. This brings us to the part that Bolshevist ideology plays in the present world situation. The equating, in the Western civilization, of Russia with a class war theory is itself a triumph of Russian propaganda. Theories in politics are techniques. Politics is power activity, not reasoning or arguing or proving. For any Westerner to believe that Russia represents some sort of desire to reform society or economics along the lines of favoring this class or that class is to show himself utterly incapable of political thinking. Nor is it any more correct to think that Russia wishes to organize the whole world along the same economico-socio-political lines as present-day Russia. The Russian mission is to destroy the West, and any inner agitation within the West promotes this mission. Class war, race war, social degeneration, crazy art, decadent films, wild theories and philosophies of all kinds, serve this vast Russian program. Communism is just one of these, but if another were more effective tomorrow, it would replace it. The ideal of communism, as a theoretical program for the reorganization of society, does not exist in the world of facts, either in Russia or America. The communism that the West has to fear is of two varieties, neither of them in the least bit theoretical: first, class war, and second, the communist organization. The first is an entirely native thing which can only be liquidated by the 20th century idea of ethical socialism. Pending this liquidation, it serves the Russian purpose of weakening and disintegrating the West from within. The second is simply the direct enforcing agent within the West of the political commands from Moscow. At the moment, 1948, Russia's sole remaining enemy in the field is America. Towards America it occupies a position superior in every way except the technical. Its weapon against America is inner undermining through propaganda and social degeneration. These methods are efficacious against America because of the great spiritual split in that country between the true soul of the American people and the upper culture distorting stratum. Culture retardation in America makes 19th century materialistic propaganda and ultra-crazy social ideals effective in that country. The presence of the distorter in Russia is shown by the fact that the ruling personnel are disproportionately drawn from this group, by the fact that anti-Semitism is a crime, and more than anything else by Russian policy in regard to Palestine. For the 4 years, 1944 to 1948, Russian policy was the negation, at every point, of American policy. Nonetheless, in the question of partitioning of Palestine, a part of the world of Islam, the Moscow regime was divided on the supporting of world policy of the Jewish culture state-nation race, even though it was in the imperialistic interests of Russian policy to oppose America on this issue. But the nature of culture distortion as a mere illness is shown again by the situation of the moment. Despite their parallel inner situations, Russia and America are moving to war against one another. This period is one of preparation of and for the Third World War. The nature of politics, of the political side of human nature, impels this war, and the presence of active alien groups in the two existing political powers plays only a subordinate role in this great fact. Its role is to manage the war so that its own world position is not damaged by the outcome. Russia's strategic position vis-à-vis America is vastly superior. First, the great fundamental fact of Russia's position on the planet confers an inestimable advantage. The Northeast Quadrant, as already seen, is the prime focus of world control in the age of absolute politics. Russia is situated within this quadrant, whereas America is not even in the political world, which lies in the Eastern Hemisphere, the ultimate source of 6 times as much power as the Western Hemisphere. The Northeast Quadrant, in a military sense, is controlled partly by Russian arms, and partly by American arms. The Russian holdings are contiguous and integrated. The Russian diplomatic method is that of terror, military occupation, kidnapping, and assassination. The American method is degenerative propaganda, puppet regimes which conduct their own terror, and financial conquest. Of these two methods, Russia's is entirely superior. Wars are fought with soldiers, and not with money, and diplomacy is simply war preparation and war exploitation. Financial means therefore are subsidiary to military means, a mere adjunct to them. The American holdings in the Northeast Quadrant are bought, but they can never be finally paid for. They are dependent upon the maintenance of puppet governments consisting of the least valuable stratum in Europe, the party politicians who will sell themselves for money. Thus revolts, in the American spheres in Europe, of the more vigorous and honorable stratum, would automatically terminate America's ascendancy, whereas revolts in Russia's sphere under present conditions would be drowned in blood. Of course, in the last analysis, America's financial diplomacy is backed by American bayonets, but the dangerous illusion in the American mind as to the value of financial means is nevertheless there. Russian diplomacy increases Russian prestige, while American diplomacy rouses hopes of material gain in its subject populations, and panders to the lowest instincts of greed and laziness. America conducts a gigantic hanging holiday called war crimes, which is aimed at settling old Semitic vengeance scores. Russia values subject individuals according to their present and future value to Russian plans, and is not interested in their past actions. However, if Russia did choose to institute a war crime slaughter, it could instruct the Americans in technique. The precedent of the Florensky trial during the Red Terror in Kiev in the summer of 1919 is illustrative. Professor Florensky of Kiev University was suspected of anti-Semitism. Irritated by his lack of humility, one of his judges, Rosa Schwartz, drew a revolver and shot him dead at his trial. Russia's situation in the Northeast Quadrant bestows upon Russia the possibility of a high degree of application of the strategic principles of concentration, and economy of force. America's remoteness on the other hand compels it to support an enormous naval and marine establishment before it can put a soldier into the theater of war. Russia has the advantages of the inner line against America. And now the concluding remarks can be made about Russia, its mission, and its potentialities. Russia is outside the West. Its imperialism is a mere negative of Western unlimited organizatory imperialism. Russia's mission is thus purely destructive as far as the West is concerned. Russia is the bearer of no utopian hopes for the West, and anyone who believes it is a cultural idiot. Russia is internally split. The ruling regime does not represent the true Asiatic, religious, primitive soul, but is a technological caricature of Petronism, and the possibility is inherent in this relationship that one day this regime will go the way of the Romanov. This split can be used against Russia, just as it tries to use inner revolutionary tactics against its political enemies. Such a tactic was used with success against the Romanov regime in 1917 by the West. By virtue of its physical situation, on the border of the West, Russia will, and must always, remain the enemy of the West, as long as these populations are organized as a political unit. Japan. The creation of the world power Japan was one of the results of American commercial imperialism of the 19th century style. It was open to hypocritical terminology that always accompanies the spirit of trade. In 1853 by a cannonade from an American fleet. Not having technological equality, the Japanese emperor surrendered at once. From then on, the development of Japan was the history of Japanese imitation of the material technique of the West and the methods of Western diplomacy. Its development was a course of high political achievement. It studied the art of the possible, and practiced it with invariable success. In less than a generation after the opening, Japan secured its foothold on the Asiatic mainland, for its leaders knew that world political power cannot be based on overcrowded islands, but must be based on control of land masses and the populations thereon, like the British Empire was based on India. By the last decade of the 19th century it was ready for war. In the Sino-Japanese War, it was successful and extended the mainland base. By 1904, it judged the situation favorable for a war against the greatest Western land power, for at that time, Russia figured in the world as a member of the Western state system. In this Second Great War, it was victorious both from the military and political standpoints. Its capable political tradition knew how to exploit a military victory. In 1914, it cleverly attacked the weakest of the national garrisons in the Far East, and acquired all the German Far Eastern Empire for no military cost whatever. Its mainland position was constantly expanded. After the First World War, it suffered a diplomatic defeat at the hands of England and America, and retired to wait. In more than 3/4 of a century, from 1853 until 1941, Japan did not make a political mistake. This is a remarkable achievement in world history, and it built up a strong tradition of confidence in the national tradition and leadership. This tradition was reinforced by the primitive religiousness of Japan, which believes in the humanity of God, the divinity of the emperor, and the divine mission of Dai Nippon. In 1941, the Japanese government was faced with a new political situation. In the war between the West and Russia, its purely political interests lay in a Western victory. This would have extended Japan's mainland position to vast limits to the borders of India, to Tibet, to Xinjiang. But another Western power, America, was in the possession of part of the mainland, thousands of islands in Japan's expansion sphere, a mighty Pacific fleet, and the will to annihilate Japan. Leaving Europe to fight its battle against Russia, it decided to devote all of its military energy to the war against America. Only in a limited sense can this be called a mistake, for there is no certainty America would not have attacked if Japan had engaged Russia instead of America. But on fundamental grounds, it is better to attack a power already battling for its life than to engage a fresh one. Any possible attack from the new quarter can then be sought to be contained while the embattled power is disposed of. In any case, the Second World War was ended by a negotiated peace between Japan and America. The Japanese nation, state, emperor, and institutions were to be maintained, the Japanese army was to be honorably disbanded, and American troops were to be permitted to occupy Japan. This decision was carried out with religious discipline. It involved no loss of Oriental faith to the leaders, the nation, or the individuals, for it was the command of the God Emperor to adopt new conditions. The technological American superiority that had brought about the disciplined transformation from enmity to the teacher-pupil relationship within a few days had put Japan back into the spiritual situation of 1853. A period of learning was required. Once more America would teach it the techniques necessary to world power. The American troops were seen as the emperor's servants to instruct his people. Does any Westerner think that the tradition of the samurai dissolved in a week? In a nation with the Japanese spiritual integration and firmness, a nation which produced an endless succession of kamikaze pilots, whose generals surrendered to save the lives of their troops and then committed harakiri. So to think is to fail to understand history and its silent, irresistible force destiny. The soul of the Japanese people has a destiny. Its mission, like the Russian, and the other non-Western forces, is simply denial and destruction of the West. Even coordinated and intelligent American policy in Japan cannot wipe out this soul, but can only hope to monopolize the means of its politico-military expression. But the American policy, springing from culture distortion in America, of rebuilding and aiding Japanese tradition, of asserting and solidifying Japanese spirituality, strengthens Japan enormously, and makes its future more hopeful. What this future may be, no one can tell. An American Revolution could sharply reverse the direction of affairs. The Third World War could affect it one way or the other. When a power is submerged, as Japan is, its own will counts for little. Japan is, and will remain the enemy of the West, because it belongs to the outer forces, and the motive force of world politics in this age of absolute politics is in culture. In the great spiritual division of the world, Japan belongs with the non-Western forces. Japan's threat to Europe is mitigated by geographical distance, but its threat to Australia makes the American-Japanese enmity more real, for America has the cultural duty of protecting Australia since stupid Western diplomacy has lost all European influence in this area. Japan is not in a class with India and China, for it is integrated. Politics is a struggle of will against will. India and China have, as such, no will. They are not organic units, but mere collections of areas and populations brought under one name for convenience. Their negative will is diffused throughout all the individuals, whereas the will of Japan is concentrated and articulated into a nation-bearing stratum. Japan is thus the potentiality of a power of the future, while India and China will always remain mere spoils for powers from without. More important than the outer forces to Europe and to its future is America. The external situation, plans, and possibilities of America must be examined. America. The armed forces under the command of the Washington regime control northern and western Europe, part of southeastern Europe, the entire Mediterranean, part of the Near East, Middle East, and Far East, as well as all of Central America, and most of South America. In addition, this regime controls all the seas of the world. The vastness of this empire is attenuated by its looseness. The physical remoteness of America from the political world is the first weakness of this empire. The second is the lack of imperial thinking in its rulers. The third is the old-fashioned financial diplomacy, which is the sole link holding large areas of the empire. The fourth is the terrible inner tension created by the split between the true soul of the American people and the culturally alien regime. The first weakness dictates that America's war effort against Russia for control of the world must be much greater than Russia's. This weakness of the American empire is not realized in America, where complete ignorance of present-day power relationships perpetuates the 19th century belief of the supremacy of sea power over land power. There was perhaps something to support this belief when the entire hinterland of Asia, the world, was politically passive, and the control of a few bridgeheads and strongpoints along the coast automatically gave access to and control over the hinterland. But in the new conditions of outer revolt, the reflex of the stage of development of the Western civilization, when all the formerly subject populations of the world are politically restless or active, land power emerges as the only power, and sea power is a mere auxiliary. It is simply communication and transportation, but it is fighting that decides power struggles. This means armies, and whereas Russia can put its entire effort into land power, America must have gigantic sea power as a mere prerequisite to engaging in the battle for control of the world. In addition, the most reliable populations in the Russian Empire, for military purposes, are half again as numerous as the most reliable in the American Empire, and the Russian birth rate is primitively high, while that of America's fighting elements is in a severe decline. Another aspect of the same weakness of the American Empire is its reliance on technical superiority. This is another form of the sea power fallacy, in that it thinks that power can have another basis than armies. Weapons are mere adjuncts in a fight, primary is, and always has been, the spirit. Against this fundamental life fact, no weapon can prevail. Technical superiority is helpless in the last analysis unless it is accompanied by superiority of willpower, of the will to conquer. The same weapon that could give a military victory might be helpless afterwards against a country occupied by soldiers of the victorious power, which might find itself politically defeated. The second weakness of the American Empire is the fact that the culture disease of retardation in America has prevented the arising of true imperial thinking. Imperial thinking cannot develop in a land saturated with pacifist propaganda, with pleasure madness as the content of life, and intellectual averageness as the spiritual ideal. Imperial thinking cannot be built on League of Nations dawdling, nor on drooling idealism of any kind, and much less on blind hatred as the cornerstone of a foreign policy. Yet, for foreign political purposes, this is all there is in America. There is no level of the populace, no American group, which feels any higher task than self-enrichment. There is no samurai, no Comintern, no Black Dragon Society, no nobility, no idea, no nation, no state. Nor will imperial thinking begin to develop merely because an inner culturally alien group wants to use the supine American populations as biological units to carry out its revenge imperative against the Western civilization. It must arise spontaneously in the higher strata. Precisely because these higher strata are lacking as a guiding elite in America, no true imperial thinking can arise in America in the near future. The third weakness, that of reliance on puppet regimes secured primarily by financial means, and only secondarily by military means, is simply one more effect of culture retardation. The financial method of conquest is outmoded. This is the age of absolute politics, and power is not to be bought, nor is it secured as a means of enrichment. Whoever does not realize this spirit of the age will find himself suddenly defeated by gigantic events which we could not foresee. Financial diplomacy is in this age simply stupidity. The fourth weakness is the inner tension in America itself. The future of American nationalism is quite definite spiritually. It will participate in the struggle for American control of the American destiny. This struggle arises out of the organic nature of things. The host and the parasite are hostile, and the hostility cannot be abolished. How, when, with what initial success, these are imponderables. In any case, Europe must know, and realize deeply, that both of the occupying powers, America and Russia, are inwardly split horizontally. In both of them the ruling stratum is inwardly spiritually alien to the great mass of dominated peoples. This is a primary, elemental fact. It is essential to a long-range view of world possibilities, a view which puts aside both optimism and pessimism, cowardice and bravado, exultation and despair. These powers differ for Europe's purposes in that the true America belongs to the Western civilization, and the true Russia can never possibly belong thereto. But in the immediate, short-range view, extending over only the next quarter of a century, one of them is more dangerous than the other. Russia's total alienness is realized all through Europe, horizontally and vertically. Under a Russian occupation of Europe, even the very European communists would soon be in the great, never-ending revolt against the barbarian. The European Michel element, with its weak urge toward parliamentary babbling and money-loving, and its detestation of the firm, strong, Prussian European willpower, would find itself cleansed of its spiritual sickness under the lash of the Mongolian. It would become European. Nor could a Russian occupation hope forever to hold Europe down. First, the European will and intelligence are stronger than the will and intelligence of the barbarian. Secondly, the barbarian has not sufficient human resources to enslave the Western civilization at this stage of its development, when its inner imperative is cast in the form of will to power, and the urge to unlimited authoritarian imperialism. America, on the other hand, is not generally understood in Europe. Even in the culture-bearing stratum of the West there is no clarity that America under culture-distorting leadership is Europe's total enemy. Only the development of historical thinking has enabled Europe to understand the organic nature of culture, and of culture pathology. For the first time, Europe can now see America in its duality, underneath, the America of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, of the frontiersman, the explorer, the men of the Alamo, above, the America of culture distortion with its monopoly of cinema, press, radio, mind and soul, and with its revenge imperative directed against the body and soul of the Western civilization. By making use of culture retardation in Europe, the distorter in America is able to split Westerners and divide them against one another on old, outgrown, 19th-century nationalistic lines. The spiritual splitting and balkanizing of Europe serves his purpose. For those who oppose this purpose, he is now demonstrating the sanctions he will employ against them, in his war crime slaughter. The differing relationship between Russia and America to Europe is thus simply that Russia, even though it try to split Europe, can only unite it. The effect of American occupation, however, is to split, for it appeals to the sub-Europeans, the retarders, the Michel element, the money worshippers, the lazy and the stupid, and to the worst instincts in every European. The material destruction accompanying a Russian occupation is considerable, so is that accompanying an American devastation. What difference does it make to Europe whether the Russians move a factory to Turkestan, or the Americans blow it into the air? The difference between the spiritual effect of the two occupations makes the Russian less harmful. Russian arrests in the night, assassinations, deportations to Siberia, convince no one. American war crime slaughters are another technique for splitting Europe while simultaneously actualizing the revenge imperative of the culture distorter. The terror. It is a weakness, in fact stinginess of heart, not to speak well of one's enemies, and not to pay them the honor they deserve. Frederick the Great. Preface to his History of the 7 Years' War, 1764. Within each high culture, the universally prevailing feeling has been the same as the quoted sentiment of Frederick II. The onset of the civilization crisis itself has not served completely to destroy this wordless honor feeling. However fierce the battles, or prolong the war, every victor over an opponent within the same culture has always shown generosity and respect to his former foe. It inheres in the very nature of politics within a high culture that it is carried on solely for power, and not for the massacre of individuals after the war, whether by hanging or starvation. Once the power is gained, the objective is reached and the individuals of the former enemy are seen no longer as enemies, but simply as human beings. In the 1,000 years of Western history, there have naturally been a few exceptions. Dishonor has always existed. But the exercise of malice against a defeated opponent was never countenanced on a large scale, or over a long period, and it simply could not have occurred between two groups both belonging to the Western culture. In very late times this organic imperative has been well illustrated. For example, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox in 1865, the fierce warrior Grant, so ruthless in the field, showed himself a magnanimous and kindly victor. The case of Napoleon shows the same organic imperative at work in his captors, both after Leipzig, and even after Waterloo. Earlier, the English government, even when at war with him, had notified him of a plot against his life. Similarly, after the capture of Napoleon III, Bismarck saw to his honorable treatment and safety. But between a power belonging to a high culture and one belonging to a different culture, these honor usages have never been generalized, either in the conduct of warfare or in the treatment of a conquered foe. Thus in Gothic times, the Church forbade the use of the crossbow against members of the Western culture, but sanctioned its employment against the barbarian. In such cases, the opposing group has not been looked upon as a mere opponent, but as a true enemy, as the 20th century once more uses that word to describe elements outside the Western civilization. The Spanish court-martial which tried the last Inca, and sentenced him to death, did not feel bound by the same honor obligation toward him that they would have felt to any Western leader of his status. A fortiori, the community of honor which arises within a culture does not extend to the outsider belonging to no culture whatever the barbarian. Thus Jugurtha, Mithridates, Sertorius, and Vercingetorix were all hunted down to their personal deaths by the Romans. The barbarian understands the relationship in the same way, as the massacres of Mithridates, Juba, the Goths, Arminius, and Attila all show. It is not people nor race, but the great fact of belonging, or not belonging, to a high culture which is decisive in this connection, as is shown by the slaughters of Genghis Khan's Mongolians and the present-day Russians, both outside a high culture. Thus when, after the Second World War, a huge and inclusive program of physical extermination and politico-legal socio-economic persecution was instituted against the defenseless body of Europe, it was quite clear that this was no intracultural phenomenon, but one more, and the most transparent and admonitory, manifestation of culture distortion. That which was here distorted was, specifically, the politico-military honor usages of a millennium of high Western traditions. These usages were still observed by Europe during the Second World War, and a whole group of heads and high officials of petty states survived European imprisonment throughout the Second World War, for it had occurred to no European mind that they could be subjected to mock trials and hanged. These usages were even extended to protect the life of the son of the barbarian leader Stalin, who was a captive in Europe during the war, and were even observed in some cases by barbarian Japan, which spared the lives of high-ranking American officers, when it could have killed them either with or without mock trial. But the unconditional obligation of the honor of war, hitherto absolute throughout the Western civilization, was twisted away by culture distortion after the Second World War. Since culture disease can never influence the culture soul in its inmost depths, it can never permanently change that soul, but must wage an endless fight against it. In this fight, there can be no peace, no truce. The culture instincts will always resist disease elements, whether parasitical, retarding, or distorting. Since this is so, culture distortion proceeded to wage a European terror after the war, when there was no longer any political struggle whatever going on in the Western civilization. The history of the war crimes program shows its nature. Its foundations were laid in the anti-European propaganda with which America was deluged from 1933 onward. The propaganda itself showed that extra-cultural influences were at work, since it rejected the comity of nations and political honor. The leaders of Europe were represented as common criminals and sexual perverts, and through this vile propaganda, the idea was spread that these leaders could and should be killed. Gradually, the thesis was widened and the 20th century idea of ethical socialism was equated with evil itself, and the populations in its service were described as suffering from mass insanity, and in need of re-education by America. Culture distortion must always use the prevailing means, and established ideas and customs, in order to work its effects. Thus in America, it appealed to American patriotism and American legalism. During the Second World War, the propaganda explicitly began to demand trials of European leaders and of the culture-bearing stratum of the West. A mass treason trial was ordered in America during the War of American elements hostile to culture distortion and friendly to Western Empire. In order to overcome, at least temporarily, the native Western honor instincts, the war was represented as unique, as a war of humanity against immorality, of peace against war, a war which should therefore be followed by unique measures against the enemy in case of victory, a war in which the enemy should not only be defeated, but should be physically exterminated as punishment for crimes. Law was brought in, as usual, to prop up the structure, and the lawyers were instructed to prepare new crimes, to devise new tribunals, procedures, jurisdictions, penalties. Not only the leaders, but the armies and even the populations must be brought into new crimes. On the lower intellectual plane, this operation was represented frankly as revenge, but this necessitated the creation of new facts, since nothing like this program had ever occurred before in 5 millennia of the history of high cultures. Therefore the infamous concentration camp propaganda was devised, in order to inflame the public imagination. Fantasy became fact, lie became truth, suspicion turned into proof, persecution mania transformed itself into bloodthirst. Since Europe had conducted no mock trials for which there could be revenge, the propaganda said that it would have if it had won the war, and this demonstrable lie took rank as a fact. The natural affinity of disease elements in a culture was shown by the fact that the leaders of culture-retarding groups in the West, particularly in America, supported the program. Without the culture-retarding forces in America, the whole operation of trials and crimes had been impossible. As would be expected, the best minds of the Western civilization, both in America and Europe, rejected the entire scheme, but the power to carry it through lay with the exotic victor. The crimes scheme had 3 great facets: first, the mass trial of the highest European leaders, the authors of the European Revolution of 1933; second, the mass trials of soldiers of all grades who had distinguished themselves in the war, of the military personnel who had served as guards of the prison camp, and of civilians who had taken part in air raid defense; third, the individual trials of millions of small civilian members of mass political organizations. Although these proceedings were called trials, they were not actually that at all, for there was no legal system in existence which authorized any such action. Western international law excluded the possibility that the leaders of an enemy state could be tried and hanged as a part of the exploitation of victory, for its basic principle was that of sovereignty of states. International law thus rested purely on comity, and not on force. A genuine trial presupposes, on the purely legal side, a pre-existing legal system, a pre-existing judiciary empowered to enforce the law, jurisdiction of the subject matter, and jurisdiction of the person. Without a pre-existing law, there can be no offense, no tribunal, no jurisdiction of subject matter or person. Mere custody is not jurisdiction, or else a kidnapper could be said to have jurisdiction of his victim. Mock trials are nothing new in cultural history, but as between members of the same culture, they are simply dishonor, and dishonor reflects on its author, and on him only, and never on the victim. They are dishonor, merely because they are deceit and subterfuge; they are an attempt to do by form of law, that which instinct and conscience forbid. Thus the preliminaries to the killing of Louis XVI and of Charles of England were not trials, even though they were so named by those who participated in them, for under the existing law in both France and England at these times the monarch was sovereign and thus answerable to no tribunal. Entirely apart from strictly legal grounds, and considerations of the intracultural honor community, there is an independent source of reasons why the war crimes processes could not be described as trials, and that is human psychology. A true trial presupposes impartiality in the court, actual mental impartiality, apart from mere legalistic presumption of innocence. But the actions in question were openly and avowedly against enemies. The victims were legally formulated as enemies, and the war was declared to be in legal continuance. Enmity excludes impartiality, and this was nowhere present in the crimes program. In an earlier age, the trials by which Philip the Fair eliminated the Knights Templar as a power, the trials of Joan of Arc, of Lady Alice Lisle, and of the Duc d'Enghien, were not true trials because of partiality in the court. A fortiori, where the trials are the result of the impact of 2 different cultures upon one another, there can be no question of an actual and fair trial, as the trial of the Christ by the Roman procurator and the trial of Atahualpa by a Spanish court-martial are there to show. The Nuremberg spectacle was one more, and the most conclusive, instance of the complete irreconcilability of 2 culture souls, and of the abysmal depth to which culture disease can descend. Even while the trial was going on, its organizers ordered their press to speculate for the public on what method of execution would be used against the victims. It is, of course, impossible to deceive the entire population of a culture forever. There is a certain stratum which sees through devices to the reality, and in this stratum, the crimes propaganda and trials had precisely the opposite of the intended effect. Everyone who has oriented himself historically knows that the epithet criminal can be placed, with superficial and temporary success, on anyone in the power of another. During the millennium of Western history, hundreds of creative men or persons in high places have been either charged with crime, or imprisoned. The Holy Roman Emperor Conradin Hohenstaufen was beheaded even though he was the most highly placed secular person in Christendom. A few others either jailed or charged with crime were, Coeur de Lion, Roger Bacon, Arnold of Brescia, Giordano Bruno, Columbus, Savonarola, Joan of Arc, Galileo, Cervantes, Charles of England, Shakespeare, Oldenbarn Nivelle, Louis XVI, Lavoisier, Voltaire, Napoleon, Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, Thoreau, Wagner, Charles XII, Frederick the Great, Edgar Poe, Napoleon III, Garibaldi. The French Reign of Terror, beginning in 1793, lasted little more than a year, even though it grew out of prolonged and continuing conditions of inner and outer political activity heightened to a degree hitherto unknown in Europe. The new French Republic was carrying on in the field a struggle for its life, and fighting simultaneously against the majority its own population. Under these conditions of struggle for power, the horrors of the Terror can be seen historically to fit into the political scene. The dramatic qualities of the Terror cannot obscure the fact that it only put to the guillotine a number calculated by its opponents at between 2,000 and 4,000. Quite different was the Terror after the Second World War. Its entire motivation was beyond politics, as that word is used in intracultural power activity. It was not a phase of a struggle for power. Defeated Europe was completely occupied by armies serviceable to culture distortion. No physical resistance was present. Thus, from pure revenge imperative, it embarked on a program of persecution and mass killing. The elaborate pretense of legalism is another sign of culture disease. So prolonged an orgy of self-deception to attempt to cover up patent dishonor would be impossible to any group belonging to a high culture against an intracultural opponent. Suffice it to say that there is no record of any such proceeding in 5 millennia of higher history. Culture distortion is also evinced by the indefinite prolongation of the killing program. The organizers of the scheme had no honor community with the people they tried to death, and could have continued it forever. 3 years after it began, the enterprise was on a larger scale than when it started. No development of self-disgust takes place in a culture alien, the way it finally did even in the intransigent Jacobins and the canaille of Paris. The ridiculous legalistic equipment, which was used purely pro forma, and which was in no case allowed to interfere with conviction and sentence, is a further sign of extra-cultural origin. Western law thinking has never been extended to the annihilation of Western honor, even though it has often been put to political, economic, or religious use in the disguise of pure legal thinking. But to the cultural alien, the fine sense of limitation is lacking, and he continues to wear the disguise even after he is recognized. Nor is the crimes program a manifestation of barbarism, for barbarism is far more hostile to the polysyllabic legerdemain of the lawyers than is even the honor feeling of the upper strata of a high culture. Thus, in its occupation of Europe, the Russians carried on no crimes killings, but simply slew when they wished, without mock trials. The French Terror had also a positive idea for the nation, and the killing and destruction was for the purpose of imposing a new regime through intimidation and destruction of the old. When it had attained its political objective, the Terror was spent. The Terror after the Second World War, however, started with the political objective already gained, and had thus no cultural political raison d'etre. Its motive was existential hatred, and the aim was simply total, apocalyptic, revenge, but revenge is no part of culture politics. Groups within a culture, in previous history, have always extended generosity to a conquered foe within the same culture, even in the stage of annihilation wars. It is only the enemy state that is sought to be destroyed, not the sum total of individuals. The very length of the trials themselves shows culture disease. The French Terror tried to death even such an important person as the Queen of France in 2 days, but the infamous concentration camp mock trials were dragged out to many months, and the Nuremberg torture was prolonged to a year. The cruelest aspect of the larger scheme was undoubtedly that directed against the small people, since it aimed at millions of persons. Puppet regimes, set up by the American regime, instituted denationalization courts to implement the grand program of mass persecution. The victims were completely deprived of their property in every form. Professional men were forced to become manual laborers. Young men were forbidden to attend universities. Lower food rations were issued, this technique having been learnt from Lenin's program of exterminating the bourgeoisie in Russia. Opponents of culture distortion were sent to jail for years. The families of the victim were treated similarly so that they could not help him. The entire program, in all its aspects, was of course contrary to the documented international conventions binding all Western states to a common code of cultural international community of politico-military honor. These conventions represented Western feelings, or they would not have been concluded, and thus their total disregard by America in its post-war occupation of Europe is the final proof of the culture pathological nature of the vast terror program. No Western force could ever have engaged in the prolonged and fraudulent attempt to present Western international law as a penal code, for it never had any penal provision whatever. But culturally alien elements, in the last analysis, never penetrate to the feeling behind Western ideas and institutions, any more than Westerners could ever grasp the subtleties of the Kabbalah or the Maimonidean philosophy. Last, and spiritually most important, is the desperate attempt which the terror made at a transvaluation of all Western values. The life and health of the host are the death of the parasite, and the flourishing of the parasite is the sickness and distortion of the host. Therefore, any natural and normal attempt by culture-bearing elements within the West to oppose culture-pathological phenomena in the Western civilization were represented as criminal and morally reprehensible. Opposition to culture distortion and its instruments was declared as a crime, and support of the European Revolution of 1933 was declared subject to the penalty of death in the attempt at transvaluation of values. An official of the American forces, himself not a member of the Western civilization, went so far as to say officially that if Bismarck were alive, he would be tried as a criminal by the American forces. Finally, the notorious Control Council Law No. 10 actually defined as criminals the leaders in the political, military, industrial, and financial life of Europe and its Eastern associated states, in those very words. This terror shows the significance of an American occupation of Europe. The nature of America, as a colony, separated by great distance from the mother soil of the Western culture, explains fully why culture disease has been able to play such a dominating role there. Western honor usages, extant also in America, have never taken such deep root in that country, and thus the cultural alien was able to engraft his revenge imperative onto the American organism. Such a process is organic and therefore has a direction. It cannot go on forever without a deep and powerful challenge by the national instincts of America, but in this decisive age, the meaning of America to Europe is symbolized in the terror program of culture distortion which it let loose in the former states of Europe, now become its colonies, after the Second World War. The abyss. Europe is in a spiritual political abyss. The history of the West since 1914 is exacting now its price of shame and horror. Frontier obsession has developed to the point where there are no longer any European frontiers, and the frontiers of extra-European powers meet in Europe. Universal poverty, disease, starvation, looting, cold, and deliberate killing of members of the culture-bearing stratum of the West. These are the legacy of nationalism and yesterday patriotism. They thought about the Rhine, and not about the Amur, the Obi, the Yangtze, the Ganges, the Nile, the Niger. As a consequence, Europe has become spoils, and marauding powers from without dispose of its lives and treasures, even of the works of art which express its inmost soul. Have we seen in the past 9 years events which spell the end of the Western civilization? The sacred soil of our culture is occupied by armies of barbarians and distorters of our cultural instincts and heritage. Once Rollo, William of Normandy, the Hohenstaufen, Coeur de Lion, de Bouillon, the Teutonic Knights, Reinhold van Dassel, Gustav Adolf, Wallenstein, Alba, Cromwell, Richelieu, Turenne de Saxe, Frederick the Great, Pitt, Napoleon, Bismarck, trod this soil. Today, as I write, it is occupied by Kyrgyzstanians, Mongolians, Armenians, Turkstani, Senegalese, Negroes, Americans, Jews. These culturally alien armies rule through traitor governments, whose members have sprung up from between the cracks in the pavement, and who deal in hatred of the spirit of the age. Since 1900, Europe has been declining steadily in world power. The First World War accelerated vastly the outer revolt against the West, and the Second World War eliminated Europe entirely from the combinations of world power. The European Revolution of 1933 was a ray of hope for Europe. It seemed that Europe also would be able to engage in the struggle for world dominion, and could reconquer the world position which is the basis of the physical life of Europe's millions, instead of being the mere spoil for barbarians from without. What resources can Europe muster in the struggle for its spiritual and physical survival? This is another way of asking, what are the inner possibilities of Europe? 2. The false and distorted form of the Second World War may perhaps lead some to think that culture is not the motive force of politics in this age of absolute politics. But in actuality, the Second World War is the proof of it. In reality, 3 separate wars were going on within the phenomenon called the Second World War. First, there was the war of the culture-distorting group against the Western civilization. Secondly, there was the war of the Western civilization against Russia. Third was the war between America, as colony of the Western civilization, against Japan. All 3 of these wars were culturally motivated. The conflicts now going on in the world also are based on culture contrasts. Throughout the entire Western civilization there is a horizontal struggle, underneath, the vigorous and heroic idea of the 20th century, ethical socialism, above, the disease phenomena of parasitism, retardation, and distortion. Added to this are the struggle of Japan against America, also a cultural struggle, and the conflict between America and Russia. The present situation in Europe is dominated by the fact that in the depths the 20th century idea triumphed in the Second World War, and only on the surface did the 19th century ideas of capitalism, materialism, nationalism, and yesterday patriotism prevail. All over Europe, and not alone in Prussia, Germany, the birthplace of the 20th century idea of ethical socialism, the spirit of the age is present. There are attempts to confuse it, to distort it, to direct its energy onto false issues. In particular is the technique employed of trying to rouse 19th century national hatred and old-fashioned patriotism, the suicide of Europe. In the first phase of annihilation wars, all the nations of Europe were the victim of annihilation, and the outer forces were the victor over the whole civilization. This process cannot be undone. Whatever has once become a fact remains and forces adaptation to it. Thus it is, that both for material and spiritual reasons, nationalism of the 19th century type is dead. It is dead spiritually for the reason that Europe has reached in its cultural development the stage of Imperium. Even if there were no such frightful outer threat as exists, this would still govern. But, in addition, the basis of the power of every one of the old Western nations has been destroyed. No single one has sufficient resources, spiritual or material, to engage in world politics independently. Their only choice is to be vassals collectively, or to form a unity of culture, state, nation, race, people. This creates automatically an economic, political, military unit. On the other hand, Europe can resist the 20th century Prussian-German idea of ethical socialism, and continue the present chaos. The result of this will be the political elimination of the Western civilization forever from the world struggle. Russia, Japan, or other powers not now in existence, will fight one another for control of the ruins of the West, as the barbarian outsiders waged endless wars for the control of the Egyptian, Babylonian, Chinese, Roman, and Islamic empires. The purely spiritual and intellectual tasks remaining to our culture can fulfill themselves under a barbarian domination, but the grandest inward task of all, and the sternest imperative of the strongest willpower ever known to history, will remain unaccomplished: the creation of the Western Empire. In every stratum of Europe it must be realized that the unity of the West is something that can only be accomplished on one basis. From 1940 to 1944, nearly all Europe was united, and the eventuation of the Second World War showed to the entire world the unity of Europe, for all Europe was defeated, despite the tricky attempt to make some parts of the West feel victorious. European unity can only be brought about by force, since that is the sole weapon history knows. The way the outer forces defeated Europe is the same way it can be liberated and reunited. Whether this takes the form of civil or international wars is unimportant, the two fronts are the same. On the one side, the barbarian and the distorter, chaos and death; on the other the spirit of the age, the Prussian European idea. This idea is not national in the old 19th century sense. This was the propaganda of parasitic elements, and convinced only the sub-Europeans. This idea cuts straight across the old national divisions of the West. It is itself simply the soul, the mission, the ethical form of a new nation, a nation whose population and home territory are coterminous with those of the older nation formations of the West: Spain, France, Italy, England, and Germany. It is no federation, no customs union, no economic device to maintain Europe at a marginal level of existence sufficient to keep it from revolting against the barbarian and distorter. It is a spiritual unity, and naturally as a result an economic unity. But this spiritual unity would have to occur even though it were economically injurious, for economics no longer motivates history. Imperium. The history of nations in the Western culture follows a great triadic development. The thesis was Western unity, the unity of the Crusades and the period of empire and papacy. This continued, in the great essential of preserving this unity vis-à-vis the barbarian, down to the middle of the 18th century. The Antithesis was the period of political nationalism, which accompanied materialism, and which exercised such a powerful sway that at one time men thought the nations produced culture, instead of the reverse. Finally, the insistence upon nationalism became so great, that some leaders were willing to betray their nations into bondage to extra-Western forces rather than join a united Western organism. The Synthesis is the period of the future. It exists everywhere in the minds of the culture-bearing stratum of the West, and for a while it was actualized, in its first crude, provisional, form during the Second World War. It returns to the thesis, but retains the creations of the Antithesis, for this great synthesis is not a mere negative. No European nation of the older type can any longer, under this new idea, be the object of any forcible attempt to change or abolish its local characteristics. Considered as a spiritual reality, the synthesis cannot be spread by physical force. Not only in the sphere of nations, but in the totality of the life manifestations of the Western civilization, the synthesis penetrates with its new values, its higher imagination, and its new creative powers. During the progressively radical disuniting of the West, the antagonism of the various ideas for one another sharpened itself into mania. Trade contested against authority, the Third Estate against society, Protestant against Catholic, North against South, England against Spain, France against Spain, England against Prussia, science against religion, rationalism against the soul, class war against authority and property. The nationalist fever, the worst of all, was spread everywhere by the armies of France under the great Napoleon. The same nationalistic fervor of his troops which gave him his victories on 150 fields communicated itself, since it was the content of the spirit of the age. This spirit infected the entire West, and informed the Spanish resistance and the Prussian rising which finally brought him down. There was no inner necessity for the horrible denouement of the age of nationalism, of annihilation wars. It was not destiny, but culture pathology, that the entire West went down, and that outsiders came in to fight their wars over its soil, and with its blood. Nevertheless it happened, and the gruesome result of the Second World War imposes a new way of thinking upon the entire culture-bearing stratum of the West. On the contrary, however, there is inner necessity in the final passing of the age of nationalism and annihilation wars. The great synthesis, Imperium, replaces it. The synthesis contains within it the older components of thesis and antithesis. The primal Gothic instincts of the Western culture are still present in the Imperium idea. It cannot be otherwise. Also present are the various ideas which these instincts, within the framework of this culture, shaped for itself, the religions, the nations, the philosophies, languages, arts and sciences. But they are present no longer as contrasts, but as mere differences. Gone forever gone is any notion that one of these ideas, national, linguistic, religious, social, has the mission of wiping out another idea. The adherents of empire are still distinct from the adherents of papacy, but this distinction does not rule their minds, for uppermost now is the idea of Imperium, the return to superpersonal origins, and both of these mighty ideas have the same spiritual source. The difference between Protestant and Catholic, once excited into a casus belli, has gone the same way. Both continue to exist, but it is inconceivable that this difference could again rend the Western civilization in twain. There have been also the racial and temperamental differences of Teuton and Latin, of North and South. Once these may have contributed to the furnishing of motives to history, this can they no longer do. Again, both are part of the West, even though different, and the Imperium idea monopolizes the motivation of history. The former nations, the religions, the races, the classes, these are now the building blocks of the great imperial structure which is founding itself. Local cultural, social, linguistic differences remain. It is no necessity of the Imperium idea that it annihilate its component ideas, the collective products of 1,000 years of Western history. On the contrary, it affirms them all, in a higher sense it perpetuates them all, but they are in its service, and no longer in the center of history. Nor is the idea of Imperium to be confused with any stupid rationalistic doctrine or system, any cowardly millennium. It is not a program, it is no set of demands, no scheme for justice, no juristic quibbling with the concept of national sovereignty. Just as the future has it always to fight against the entrenched forces of the past, so must this powerful, universal idea. Its first phase is the spiritual conquest of the minds and souls of the culture-bearing stratum of the West. This is entirely inevitable. The next phase is the external actualizing, in a new state form and nation form, of the idea. In this phase there may be civil wars, perhaps belated international wars between former Western nations, possibly wars of liberation against the outer forces. The first phase has already begun, with slow, irresistible rhythm. The other phases must succeed it, whether the last perfection of the idea in actuality is reached or not. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, 1763, concluded before his birth, had fateful consequences for Napoleon, against which he struggled, as it developed, in vain. The West has to fight against the legacy of 2 world wars, which dethroned Europe, and made it vassal to barbarians and colonials. It must reconquer the world's supremacy which the jealous little opponents of the hero flung to the winds. The sole hope of success lies in the intensity and thoroughness of the accomplishment of the first stage, the victory, in the significant minds, of the Imperium idea. No force within the civilization can then resist the cultural reunion which will unite North and South, Teuton and Latin, Protestant and Catholic, Russia, England, Spain, Italy and France, in the task now waiting. 2. The employment of military forces for the purpose of combating the outer, for it is not subject to the destiny of the West. Every non-Western political organism, by its very existence, denies the West, its destiny, its imperative, and its right to physical existence. This struggle for power cannot be evaded. As already seen, the present situation of the West imposes upon it not only a struggle for power, a fight to keep from passing into slavery to the barbarian, but also a struggle for the continued biological existence of the population of Europe. There are 100 million too many Europeans for the territory of Europe. These millions are there to carry out the tremendous life task of the Western organism. Before this, their lives were maintained by the Western monopoly of industry and techniques. 2 disastrous and stupid world wars have destroyed this monopoly. The labor of these millions is not wanted. They are facing dispersal, starvation, and slavery. If the present situation continues, this result cannot be evaded. The Persepolis of Europe is beginning to take shape. Within a century, Berlin, London, Rome, Paris, Madrid can occupy the status of Tenochtitlan, Luxor, Samarra, and Tel el Amarna, if the present conquest of Europe can be maintained. Shall this be? The spiritual preconditions for the contest have been shown. This entire work has been devoted to setting forth the soul world outlook and single inner imperative which can enter this contest for the liberation of the West. How can the liberated West solve this great task of saving 100 million Western lives? There is only one solution, and it is the nearest one. The agricultural territory of Russia provides the means of preserving the population of the West, and the necessary base for world dominion of this civilization, which alone can save the West from the threat of annihilation by the outer forces. It is thus a military solution and there is no other. Our commercial industrial technical monopoly is gone. Our military technical superiority remains, as does our superior willpower, organization talent, and discipline. The glorious days of 1941 and 1942 show what the West can do against the barbarian, however superior his numbers. Like Russia, the Western civilization is situated in the northeast quadrant. Against the West, therefore, Russia enjoys none of the military advantages it has against America. The common land frontier enables the West to dispense with a gigantic assemblage of sea power as a prerequisite to the land fight. The West will be able to deploy all of its forces onto the plains where the battle for the future of the West will be fought. This military solution presupposes a liberated and united Western culture. Its precondition is the setting free of the Western soul from the domination of traitors and parasites. I set forth here then the 2 great action tasks of the inner imperative of the West. First, the liquidation of the tyranny of 19th century ideas. This means the complete cleansing of the Western soul from every form of materialism, from rationalism, equality, social chaos, communism, Bolshevism, liberalism, leftism of every variety, money worship, democracy, finance capitalism, the domination of trade, nationalism, parliamentarism, feminism, race sterility, weak ideals of happiness and the like, of every form of class war. Replacing these ideals is the strong and manly idea of the age of absolute politics, authority, discipline, faith, responsibility, duty, ethical socialism, fertility, order, state, hierarchy, the creation of the empire of the West. Second, the solution of the immediate life problem of the West by conquest on the eastern plains of a base for the further existence and fulfillment of the world mission of the Western civilization. 3. The West has something to devote to the contest that neither the barbarian nor the parasite has, the force of the mightiest superpersonal destiny that has ever appeared on this earth ball. This superpersonal idea has such tremendous force that no number of scaffold trials or massacres, no heaps of starved or pyramids of skulls, can touch it. The West has 2 centuries and tens of millions of lives of the coming generations to give to the war against the barbarian and the distorter. It has a will which has not only emerged unbroken from the Second World War, but is now more articulate all over Europe, and is gaining in strength with every year, every decade. Merely material superiority will do them little good in a war whose duration will be measured, if necessary, in centuries. Napoleon knew, and the West still knows, the primacy of the spiritual in warfare. The soil of Europe, rendered sacred by the streams of blood which have made it spiritually fertile for a millennium, will once again stream with blood until the barbarians and distorters have been driven out and the Western banner waves on its home soil from Gibraltar to North Cape, and from the rocky promontories of Galway to the Urals. This is promised, not by human resolves merely, but by a higher destiny, which cares little whether it is 1950, 2000, or 2050. This destiny does not tire, nor can it be broken, and its mantle of strength descends upon those in its service. Was mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker. What does not destroy me makes me stronger. Finis.